The mail-order bride was left at the station. A train pulls away, steam hissing. A young bride clutches her bag, abandoned, humiliated, and alone. Town gossips laugh. The church bell tolls. But then out of the shadows a quiet Amish man steps forward. His voice is steady, his eyes full of faith. "I knew you'd come to me." She thinks she's found refuge, yet the frontier holds darker secrets. The man who abandoned her wasn't just a coward, he was tangled in a railroad scheme that could cost innocent families their land. Soon, torchlight riders thunder to the farm. Jail keys rattle. And this bride, once shamed, finds herself accused of fraud, facing ruin and despair. But hidden inside her past lies knowledge that could bring the railroad empire crashing down if she dares to speak. Now in a town torn between greed and justice, one question burns hotter than the forge. Was she truly abandoned, or was she sent by Providence to save them all? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The December wind whipped across the empty train platform, cutting through Sophia Whitmore's thin coat as she clutched her carpetbag closer. Steam from the departing locomotive swirled around her ankles, carrying with it her last traces of hope. The iron wheels clattered into the distance. Leaving her alone at the small Colorado station, her fingers trembled as she pulled out the wrinkled letter one more time, though she'd memorized every word. George Wellington had promised to meet her, to make her his wife, to give her a home. But as the station clock struck 4 in the afternoon, the platform remained empty, except for curious onlookers. The depot master's boots scraped against the wooden planks as he approached. "Ma'am?" His voice carried a note of pity that made her stomach clench. "Station's closing soon. Can't have you waiting here all night?" Sophia nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Around her, townspeople whispered behind gloved hands. Their words, carried clearly in the crisp mountain air. Another one of them, mail-order brides. Foolish girl, coming all this way, bound to end in tears. Heat crept up her neck and into her cheeks. 23 years old, and here she stood, abandoned like unwanted baggage. The courthouse clerk's daughter, who should have known better. Then to trust a stranger's promises. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting long shadows across the platform. Sophia's feet had gone numb in her thin shoes, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Moving meant accepting that George Wellington wasn't coming, that she had no home, no future, and barely enough money for a night at the local boarding house. The crunch of boots on fresh snow made her look up. A tall man approached, his plain, dark clothes marking him as Amish. He carried himself with quiet dignity, removing his broad-brimmed hat as he drew near. His face was kind, weathered by sun and wind, with steady eyes that met hers without judgment. "I knew you'd come to me," he said softly, his voice carrying gentle certainty. Sophia blinked in confusion. I don't understand. My name is Brian Stoltzfus." He held his hat against his chest. 2 years ago, I wrote to the Western Bride Agency. Never received an answer. A small smile touched his lips, but here you are." The townsfolk had gone quiet, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Sophia's mind raced. This man wasn't George Wellington, wasn't the husband she'd agreed to marry. Yet there was something in his steady presence that made her racing. Heart calm. You believe I was meant to come here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian nodded. "The Lord works in ways we don't always understand, but He is faithful." He gestured toward the street where a horse-drawn wagon waited. "My farm is modest, but there's warmth and shelter there. You need not face the night alone." Sophia glanced around the platform. The depot master had retreated to his office. The last rays of sunlight were fading, and with them, her options. This wasn't how she had imagined her arrival, but perhaps Brian was right. Perhaps there was providence even in George Wellington's betrayal. "I don't wish to impose," she said, though her frozen fingers ached for warmth. "It's no imposition." Brian stepped forward and lifted her carpet bag with careful respect. "The choice is yours, but you are welcome in my home, Al." The alternative was to stay and face more pitying stares, more whispered judgments. Sophia squared her shoulders and followed Brian to his wagon. The horse nickered softly as they approached. Steam rising from its flanks in the cold air, Brian helped her onto the wooden seat, his movements gentle but proper. Once settled, he reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a thick quilt, draping it over her shoulders. The fabric carried the scent of sunshine and clean hay. And Sophia found herself relaxing, despite her uncertainty, as Brian clucked to the horse and the wagon began to move. Sophia watched the small town recede into the gathering darkness. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, bright and clear in the mountain air. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was grateful for the quiet strength of the man beside her, and the simple kindness of a borrowed quilt. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they made their way through the December evening, each turn taking them further from the station where her dreams had shattered and closer to whatever God had planned instead. The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow as Brian guided his horse along the winding country road. Thick forest gave way to scattered homesteads, each marked by wisps of smoke rising from stone chimneys into the darkening sky. In the back of the wagon, split firewood and burlap sacks of provisions shifted with each bump and turn. Sophia pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, stealing glances at her unexpected protector. Brian's hands rested sure and steady on the leather reins, his fingers bearing the marks of honest labor. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of one who chose his words with care. "The Lord moves in mysterious ways," Brian said, his eyes fixed on the snowy path ahead. "In the book of Isaiah, it is written, 'For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways.'" The scripture hung in the cold air between them. Sophia's throat tightened as she thought of George Wellington's empty promises, wondering if this quiet detour was indeed God's plan or merely her desperate grasping at safety, after what seemed like miles of peaceful silence. Brian turned the wagon onto a narrow lane. Through the gathering dusk, Sophia made out the shape of a modest clapboard house nestled against a grove of evergreens. Golden lamplight spilled from its windows, and smoke curled from the chimney like a welcome banner against the purple evening sky. As Brian drew the wagon to a halt, the front door opened. A woman emerged, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Her face bore a strong resemblance to Brian's, though softened by feminine grace. "This here is my sister Martha," Brian said, helping Sophia down from the wagon. "She's been keeping house." Since he paused, something flickering across his features. "Since my Sarah passed on." Martha stepped forward, her eyes warm with curiosity and concern. "Welcome, friend. Must be half frozen." She took Sophia's cold hands in her warm ones, studying her face. "Though I confess, brother, I didn't expect you to bring home a bride today." Sophia's cheeks flushed. "Oh, I'm not," she began, but Brian spoke first. "Sophia needs shelter. That's all we need know for now." His tone was gentle, but firm. "She'll stay until the Lord shows her proper path." Martha nodded, accepting her brother's decision without further question. "Well then, come inside where it's warm. I've got a pot of stew that's been simmering all afternoon." The interior of the house was simple but welcoming, with worn wooden floors and plain furniture that spoke of careful stewardship. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the rich aroma of beef stew filled the air. Sophia's empty stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since early morning on the train. Martha bustled about laying an extra place at the table, while Brian brought in firewood and his day's purchases. Soon they were seated around steaming bowls of stew, with thick slices of fresh bread and cups of hot tea. "Would you ask the blessing, brother?" Martha said quietly. Brian bowed his head. "Lord, we thank thee for thy bounty and thy providence. Bless this food to our use, and bless this shelter to those who seek thy peace. Amen." They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the clink of spoons against bowls. Sophia found herself stealing glances at her host Martha's efficient movements as she served more bread. Brian's quiet presence at the head of the table. These were good people. She could feel it in her bones, yet shame burned in her chest at her circumstance. After the meal, Martha showed Sophia to a small but clean guest room at the back of the house. "There are extra quilts in the chest," she said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "And should you need anything in the night, thank you, Sophia," whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You're very kind." Once alone, Sophia sank onto the narrow bed. The events of the day crashed over her like a wave-the-long train ride. The empty platform, the crushing realization that George Wellington had never intended to meet her. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she struggled to make sense of how her carefully laid plans had crumbled into this strange new reality. Through the thin walls, she heard movement in the main room. Brian's deep voice carried softly as he offered his evening prayers. "Lord, thou hast brought this woman to my door. I know not thy purpose, but I trust in thy wisdom. Grant her peace this night, and show us all thy will in thy time. Amen." Sophia pressed her hand to her mouth, muffling a sob. Here in this simple farmhouse, surrounded by the kindness of strangers, she felt both profoundly lost and inexplicably found. The shame of her situation warred with overwhelming relief at having found safe harbor. If only for the night, dawn crept over the horizon as Sophia woke to the sounds of movement in the kitchen. Her borrowed nightgown rustled as she dressed quickly. Determined to earn her keep, the wooden floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she made her way toward the busy sounds of morning. Martha stood at the kitchen table, flour dusting her apron as she measured ingredients for bread. She looked up with surprise when Sophia appeared. "You're up early, child. Please, let me help," Sophia said, rolling up her sleeves. "It's the least I can do for your kindness." Martha's eyes softened as she nodded. "Very well. Have you needed bread before?" "Some," Sophia admitted. "Though perhaps not your way." Here, Martha demonstrated her experienced hands working the dough with practiced movements. Push from the center, then fold. Let the dough tell you what it needs. Together, they worked in companionable silence, the morning light growing stronger. Through the windows, when the dough was ready to rise, Sophia grabbed the water pail without being asked. "The pump's just beyond the barn," Martha called after her. "Mind the ice around it." The metal handle of the pump was cold enough to sting. But Sophia worked it steadily, remembering her father's words about honest work being its own blessing. As she filled the bucket, she watched Brian lead to massive draft horses from the barn, their breath steaming in the winter air. He nodded a greeting as she passed, then returned to harnessing the team to a heavy plow. Sophia paused, confused. "But surely the ground is too hard for plowing." "Aye, it is now," Brian agreed, his hands never stopping their work with the leather straps. "But spring comes sudden here. Best to be ready." He patted one horse's flank. "We don't use machines like the English do. The plow and God's good earth are enough. No rifles either." Sophia asked, remembering the hunting parties that had passed. Through her Ohio town, Brian shook his head. "We trade for meat we can't raise ourselves. The Lord provides through community, not violence." His eyes held gentle conviction. "It's not always the easy way, but it's our way." Sophia carried the water inside, mind turning over this different approach to life. In town, she'd grown used to gas lamps and store-bought bread. Here, every comfort was earned through patient work. By midday, Brian announced he needed supplies from town. "You're welcome to ride along," he offered Sophia. "Might do you good to see it in daylight." The wagon ride was smoother than the previous night, though the winter air still bit sharp. Brian pointed out landmarks as they traveled a creek that never quite froze. The maple grove where they gathered sap in spring. The crossroads where the mail carrier left letters once a week. The mercantile's bell jangled as they entered. Conversation died briefly before resuming in hushed tones. Sophia kept her head high despite feeling the weight of stares. She focused on helping Brian select seeds and dry goods, learning which supplies his family preferred. Such a decent man that Brian Stoltzfus, an older woman, remarked loudly enough to be heard. "Taking in that poor girl left standing at the station shows true Christian charity, it does." Heat crept up Sophia's neck, but something steadied in her chest. Yes, she had been abandoned. But she had also been found. While Brian settled the bill, Sophia stepped outside for air. Two ranch hands stood near their horses, deep in conversation. "Wellington cleared out just in time, I reckon," one said, not noticing her presence. "Those railroad men he owed money to. They ain't the forgiving sort." "Heard he was in deep with Agent Burke's crowd," the other agreed. "Running land schemes or some such. Better to flee than face that bunch." Sophia's heart thundered. George Wellington, the man who'd promised to marry her, was mixed up with railroad corruption. The pieces clicked together. His elaborate letters. His insistence she'll sell her father's house and bring the money west. His convenient disappearance. Brian emerged from the store, arms full of packages. If he noticed her pale face, he didn't comment. But as they drove home, his quiet voice carried over the wagon's creaking. "Whatever troubles you've left behind, Miss Sophia, they can't follow you here, not unless you let them." Sophia watched the winter sun glint off snow, thinking of George's schemes and the railroad men's greed. She thought of Martha's warm kitchen and Brian's steady ways. For now, she would focus on learning this new life, but she tucked away what she'd overheard, sensing it might prove important later. Evening shadows stretched across the farmyard as Brian unhitched the horses from the wagon. Sophia helped Martha prepare a simple supper of salt, pork, and potatoes, her mind still churning over the conversation she had overheard in town. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with fresh-baked bread, but tension hung in the air like wood smoke. "Something's troubling you," Martha observed, setting 3 plates on the oak table. "Best speak it plain." Sophia's hands stilled over the potatoes she was mashing. "In town today, I heard talk about the man who was meant to meet me, George Wellington. They said he fled because of dealings with the railroad men." Brian paused. In the doorway, removing his hat. "Railroad men." His voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "Yes, they mentioned someone named Agent Burke." Sophia watched Brian and Martha exchange meaningful glances. "Thomas Burke," Brian said quietly. Taking his seat. "His men have been pressuring farmers all through the valley, coming with papers claiming the railroad has rights to the land." Martha poured fresh water into tin cups. 3 families over near Miller's Creek, already sold, said the deeds they were shown proved the railroad's claim. "Deeds can be forged," Sophia said, the words coming before she could stop them. Both siblings looked at her sharply. "How would you know about such things?" Martha asked. Sophia straightened her shoulders. "My father was a courthouse clerk in Ohio for 20 years. He taught me to recognize legitimate documents, the proper seals, the correct paper weight, the way ink behaves on different surfaces." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "He always said knowledge was the best defense against dishonesty." Brian leaned forward, his expression intent. "And you can tell a true deed from a false one." Usually, Sophia nodded. Father made sure. "I understood every detail. He'd seen too many people lose their land to clever forgeries. "Providence indeed," Martha murmured, touching the cross at her throat. A sudden clatter of hooves in the distance made them all fall silent. Through the window, dark shapes moved against the falling snow. Brian rose calmly, reaching for his lantern. "Just checking on the livestock," he said. But Sophia noticed how carefully he scanned the yard before stepping out. The horses whinnied nervously in their stalls as he made his rounds. Sophia's hands trembled as she helped Martha clear the dishes. "What if they're looking for me? What if Wellington told them I was coming?" "Then they'll find you under God's protection," Martha said firmly. She guided Sophia to sit by the fire, pressing a cup of hot tea into her hands. "Listen to me, child. The Lord often works through those the world has cast aside. Like Joseph, sold by his brothers," Brian added, stamping snow from his boots as he returned. "Or Ruth, widowed in a strange land. Or Esther," Martha smiled, "who seemed the least likely to save her people." Sophia wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, remembering her father reading those very stories. The writer's hoofbeats had faded, but her unease remained. "I should move on," she whispered. "I'm bringing trouble to your door." "No." Brian's voice was quiet but firm. "Running without purpose serves no one. If the Lord brought you here, there's reason in it." Martha nodded. "Stay, Sophia, at least until spring. We can sort this tangle together." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in hushed white. Sophia thought of the endless miles she'd traveled to reach this place, the shame of standing alone at that station. But here, in this simple farmhouse with its plain-spoken inhabitants, she felt something she hadn't expected: purpose. "I'll stay," she said finally. "And if my knowledge can help protect other families from losing their land, then perhaps," she trailed off, uncertain how to express the growing conviction in her heart. "Perhaps that's exactly why God guided you here," Martha finished gently. Brian added another log to the fire, his movements deliberate. "We'll need to be careful," he cautioned. "These railroad men don't take kindly to interference. We'll be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves," Martha quoted, reaching for her Bible. "Now, shall we have evening prayers?" As Martha's voice rose in familiar verses, Sophia felt peace settle over her like a warm quilt. The choice to stay wasn't just about finding shelter anymore. God had given her skills that might help these good people preserve their way of life. If that meant facing down railroad agents and exposing their schemes, then so be it. Snow drifted past the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called. But here, in the lamplight's glow, Sophia knew she had found her place not as a mail-order bride, but as something far more important: an instrument of truth in a land shadowed by deception. Dawn painted the frozen fields in soft rose and gold. As Sophia made her way to the barn, 2 milk pails swinging from her hands, her breath formed delicate clouds in the crisp morning air. The metal handles bit through her woolen mittens, but she welcomed the honest work that filled her days. Inside the barn, the cows shuffled and lowed softly. "Good morning, ladies," she whispered, settling onto the rough wooden stool. The rhythm of milking came easier now, after a week of practice. Warm streams hitting the pail's bottom created a gentle melody that mingled with the animals' contented sounds. Brian appeared in the doorway, carrying fresh hay. "You're getting faster," he observed, his voice warm with approval. "Martha says I might manage the evening milking alone soon." Sophia smiled, proud of her progress. Later that morning, Brian invited her to the workshop where he repaired tack and harnesses. "Watch closely," he instructed, demonstrating how to punch holes in leather straps. "The secret is keeping the spacing." Even Sophia's fingers proved nimble at the task, her stitches neat and strong. "My father always said careful work honors God," she said, smoothing the leather. "Your father was wise." Brian's hands stilled on the harness. "You speak of him often. He was all I had, after Mother passed." Sophia threaded her needle again. "When the fever took him last spring, I felt so lost." From the house, Martha's clear voice lifted in song. "Amazing Grace." How sweet the sound! The familiar hymn wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Sunday arrived bright and cold. The one-room church sat nestled among bare trees, its white, clap walls gleaming in the winter sun. Sophia smoothed her plain dress, conscious of the curious glances as she entered with Brian and Martha. When the congregation rose to sing, Sophia's voice soared pure and true above the others. "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart." She noticed several women who had whispered about her at the mercantile, now offering gentle smiles. After service, Martha spoke with the minister's wife. A travel-worn man approached Brian. "Telegraph. Came through about more railroad crews heading north," he said in low tones. "They're pressing hard for signatures on those land deals." Sophia's stomach tightened. She caught Brian's eye, seeing her own concern mirrored there. The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow as they headed home. "Thank you," Brian said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what? For staying? For facing the gossip with?" Dignity. His hands were steady on the reins. It takes courage to stand firm when others judge. The snow began falling harder, thick flakes swirling in the gathering dusk. The horses struggled against strengthening wind. "We won't make it home in this," Brian declared, turning down a side lane. "The Yoder's barn is closest." The barn was solid and warm, sweet with hay. Brian unhitched the horses while Sophia lit the lantern they kept in the wagon. Soon the animals were settled, and Brian spread clean straw for them to sit on. "The Yoders are good neighbors," he explained. "They'll understand when they find us here tomorrow." Sophia wrapped herself in the wagon's quilts, watching shadows dance on the rough-hewn beams. The storm howled outside, but here she felt oddly peaceful. "My father would have liked you," she said softly. "He valued honesty above all things." Brian's face was thoughtful in the lantern light. "Tell me about him." So she did, sharing stories of the quiet man who had taught her to read contracts and spot forgeries, who had loved poetry and justice in equal measure. Brian listened intently, asking careful questions that showed genuine interest. "I haven't spoken of him like this since," Sophia's voice caught. "Since the funeral? Sometimes grief needs time before it can become memories we share." Brian offered gently. Sophia studied his calm face, weathered by sun and wind, but somehow tender. Since her father's death, she had felt adrift, untethered. But here, in this lantern-lit barn with snow banking the walls, she realized she trusted Brian completely. Like her father, he was a man of principle and quiet strength. The horses nickered softly in their stalls. Outside, the storm continued its wild dance, but Sophia felt warmer than she had in months. Not just from the quilts or the sheltering barn, but from something growing in her heart, something that felt remarkably like belonging. 3 days after the snowstorm, the winter sun finally broke through sullen clouds. The world sparkled like diamonds had been scattered across the pristine snow. Brian and Sophia guided their wagon down the last stretch of road toward home, both quietly grateful for clear skies after their shelter in the Yoder's barn. Martha burst from the farmhouse door before they had fully stopped, her face bright with relief. "Praise be. I've been praying without cease." She hurried through the snow, her shawl fluttering. "When the storm hit so sudden-like, I feared the worst. The Lord provided shelter," Brian assured her, helping Sophia down from the wagon. "The Yoder's barn kept us warm and safe." Martha embraced them both, then stepped back with worry creasing her brow. While you were gone, a messenger came. She pulled a folded document from her apron pocket. It's from the railroad company. Brian's shoulders tensed as he took the paper, his weathered fingers careful with the official-looking document. They gathered in the warm kitchen where Martha had kept the stove well stoked. The familiar scent of baking bread filled the air, but none of them noticed it now. They claimed they already owned the land, Brian said quietly, spreading the document on the table. According to this deed, I sold it to them 3 months ago. His voice held more puzzlement than anger. But that's impossible, Martha exclaimed. You would never sell the land God blessed us with. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes scanning the document with the careful attention her father had taught her. May I? She asked, reaching for the paper. Brian nodded, watching as she held it up to the window light. Her fingers traced the ink strokes, noting their weight and flow. See here. She pointed to particular letters. The ink's consistency changes. Mid-signature. And look at these official seals, they don't quite match. The spacing is wrong. Brian and Martha gathered closer, following her trained eye across the page. My father showed me hundreds of documents during his years as courthouse clerk, Sophia explained. He taught me to spot the signs of tampering. This deed is definitely forged. Her voice grew stronger with certainty. If we take this to a circuit judge, we can prove it's false. Brian's face showed the struggle within. We Amish prefer to avoid the English courts, he said slowly. Our way is peace, not conflict. Sometimes standing for truth is the most peaceful path, Sophia replied gently. Would it not be failing our neighbors to let the railroad steal their land through lies? They might come for the Yoders next, or the Millers. Martha nodded. She speaks wisdom, brother. Remember what Father used? To say being peaceful doesn't mean being powerless. Brian stood at the window, gazing out at the snow-covered fields his family had worked for 2 generations. The land where his wife was buried, where he had hoped to raise children of his own someday. You truly believe we could prove this false? He asked Sophia. With God's help, yes. She met his eyes steadily. My father always said, justice needs brave hearts to defend it. I think perhaps that's why he led me here, to this place, at this time. Brian was quiet for a long moment, then turned back to them. I will pray on this. He placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. Show me what you see in these papers. If we are to contest this, we must be certain. Martha brought them tea while Sophia spread the document out on the kitchen table. She pulled paper and pencil from her father's old satchel and began making careful notes, marking each irregularity she found in the forged deed. The letterhead is genuine railroad stock, she murmured, but see how the date has been altered? Now, the ink is darker there, and the paper shows signs of scraping. Brian stood behind her chair, watching her work with growing appreciation for her gift. His deep voice rose in prayer. Lord, grant us wisdom to see your path clearly. Guide our steps in truth and righteousness. Sophia's pencil moved steadily across the paper as she documented evidence, her father's teachings flowing through her fingers. The afternoon light slanted golden through the windows, casting her shadow across the documents spread before her. In that moment, she felt her father's presence strongly, as if his hand guided hers in service of justice once more. Martha moved quietly around them, stoking the fire and preparing the evening meal, her own prayers joining Brian's in a soft murmur of faith and hope. The kitchen filled with the mingled warmth of lamplight, bread baking, and shared purpose. Outside, snow began falling again, gentle this time, as if God was laying a clean white page before them, waiting to see what they would write upon it with. Their acts of courage and conviction. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the Stoltzfus farm, even as the railroad threat lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. Each morning, Sophia rose before dawn, wrapping herself in the thick wool shawl Martha had gifted her. The routine of frontier life began to feel less foreign and more like a dance she was slowly learning to master. Brian taught her the ways of the farm with patient hands and few words. He showed her how to stack wood so it would stay dry, explaining that the bottom row needed to run crosswise. Like building on solid ground, he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners, just as the good book teaches. One crisp morning, Sophia insisted on helping with the heavier chores. She gripped the handle of an iron milk pail, determination set in her jaw. The bucket was fuller than she'd anticipated, and as she turned from the barn, her boots hit a patch of ice. The world tilted sideways as she tumbled. Sending fresh milk arcing through the frigid air, Brian reached her in 3 long strides, his strong hands steadying her shoulders. Milk dripped from her skirts, and suddenly, surprisingly, laughter bubbled up from deep in her chest. Brian's deep chuckle joined hers, the sound warming the winter air between them. His hands lingered on her arms, and for a moment, neither moved. "Perhaps we should start with a smaller pail," he suggested, his eyes twinkling. "Perhaps we should," Sophia agreed, her cheeks pink from more than just the cold dot in the evenings. The 3 of them gathered around the fire. Martha taught Sophia the intricate patterns of Amish quilting, their needles flashing in the lamplight as they stitched stories into fabric. Brian would read from his worn Bible, his voice steady and sure, while the women worked. Word spread through the community about the girl who had found her place among the plain folk. When the Miller family hosted their annual winter gathering, it seemed all eyes were on Sophia as she helped Martha carry in their contribution of fresh-baked bread and preserved peaches. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Pastor Yoder said quietly to Sophia as she helped serve the meal. "Sometimes what seems like a closed door is actually His hand guiding us to where we truly belong." He glanced meaningfully at Brian, who was deep in conversation with other farmers across the room. Sophia ducked her head. Bit warmth bloomed in her chest at the pastor's words. She had felt it too, the rightness of being here, as if all her steps, even the painful ones, had been leading her home. The gathering stretched late into the evening, filled with hymns and fellowship. When it was time to leave, Brian helped Sophia into his sleigh, tucking warm blankets around her legs. The runners whispered over fresh snow as they made their way home under a canopy of stars. The night was still, broken only by the soft jingle of harness bells and the horses' steady breathing. Sophia watched Brian's profile in the moonlight, remembering how he had appeared like an answer to prayer that first day at the station. "I never thought I'd feel so connected to a place," she said softly, her words making little clouds in the cold air. "Or to the people here." Brian was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the reins. "Since Rebecca passed," he finally said, "I've prayed for guidance. For someone to share this life with." He turned to look at her, his eyes earnest in the starlight. "I never expected God's answer to step down from that train." Sophia's heart quickened. "I was so afraid that day," she admitted. "But when you said you knew I'd come to you," she paused, gathering courage. "It felt like coming home, even though I'd never been here before." The sleigh slowed as Brian drew the horse to a stop. In the hushed winter night, he turned to face her fully. "You've brought light back to this house," he said. "Artha sees it too. The way you face each day with courage, how you work alongside us without complaint." His voice grew softer. "How you make me want to smile again." Sophia reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the blanket. "God has a way of turning our deepest hurts into blessings," she whispered. "I thought I was abandoned, but I was really being delivered." Brian's fingers intertwined with hers, warm despite the cold. "Would you consider?" He hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. "Would you consider making this your permanent home? Not just as a guest, but as—" "Yes," Sophia said simply, her heart full. "I would consider that very much." The horse stomped impatiently in the snow, making them both laugh softly. Brian clicked his tongue, and they continued toward home. There, clasped hands resting together beneath the blanket. Above them, the stars shone like diamonds scattered across God's own quilt. Witnessing this moment when two hearts, once broken, found themselves mending together in the quiet of a winter night. The next morning dawned bright and clear, though snow continued to drift lazily from pearl-gray skies. Inside the farmhouse, warmth radiated from both the wood stove and the hearts gathered there. Brian had asked Martha to stay close after breakfast, his usually steady hands betraying nervous energy as he cleared the table. When the dishes were done and morning prayers complete, Brian turned to face Sophia. His plain black vest was freshly brushed and his beard neatly trimmed. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, carefully carved with tiny hearts and leaves. Martha's quick intake of breath filled the kitchen. As Brian lowered himself to one knee before Sophia, the wooden floorboards creaked beneath him, and lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair. "Sophia Whitmore," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "God brought you to my door that winter evening, and since then you've brought more joy to this home than I dared hope for." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band. "Achoo! Do me the honor of becoming my wife." Tears spilled down Sophia's cheeks as she gazed at the man before her, this quiet, steadfast farmer who had offered shelter when she was lost and love when she least expected it. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, with all my heart." Brian's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Martha burst into happy tears, embracing them both. "Praise be to God," she exclaimed, already discussing wedding preparations. Word spread quickly through the community. The same townsfolk who had once whispered behind their hands about the abandoned mail-order bride now arrived at the farmhouse, bearing gifts and good wishes. Mrs. Miller brought her famous apple pies, while the Weber sisters arrived with armfuls of hymn books and suggestions for the ceremony in the following days. Martha's fingers flew as she worked on Sophia's wedding dress. The simple white cotton was transformed by tiny, even stitches and delicate tucks. "Every stitch is a prayer," Martha told Sophia as they worked together in the evenings. "A prayer for your happiness." The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and bright. Snow blanketed the world in pure white, as if God himself had laid out a carpet for the occasion. The small church filled quickly with neighbors and friends. Wooden pews creaked as people settled in, their breath visible in the cool air before the pot-bellied stove had time to warm the space. Sophia stood at the back of the church, her heart fluttering like a captured bird. The dress Martha had sewn fit perfectly, its simple lines reflecting Amish modesty while still making Sophia feel beautiful. Through the doorway, she could see Brian standing at the front, tall and strong in his best black suit. As she walked down the aisle, Sophia felt a trembling in her legs that threatened to overwhelm her. But then Brian turned, and his eyes met hers with such warmth and certainty that her steps steadied. When she reached him, his hand clasped hers firmly. Anchoring her in the moment, the minister's words washed over them as they stood together before God and their community. Brian's voice was clear and strong as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her all the days of his life. Sophia's own voice shook slightly, but her words rang with conviction as she pledged herself to him. After the ceremony, the three of them, Brian, Sophia, and Martha, shared a quiet supper at home rather than having a large celebration. Honoring Amish tradition, Martha had outdone herself, preparing a feast of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and winter vegetables preserved from their harvest. "To think," Martha said, smiling across the table, "how God's hand was in this. From the very beginning, when one door closed, he opened another." Sophia reached for Brian's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "I never thought I could be so happy," she said softly, as evening settled in. Brian suggested they step out onto the porch to look at the stars, their first moment alone as husband and wife. The night was clear and cold, with countless stars twinkling overhead like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Brian wrapped a warm quilt around their shoulders as they stood together, their breath mingling in the frozen air. But the peaceful moment shattered as the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the still night. Brian stiffened beside her, his arm tightening protectively around her waist. The riders approached fast, their torches cutting through the darkness like angry fireflies, casting ominous shadows across the snow-covered yard. "Get inside," Brian whispered urgently. But Sophia's feet seemed frozen to the porch boards as the riders drew nearer, their torches flaring bright against the dark sky. The peaceful starlit moment shattered as 6 riders thundered into the yard, their torches casting wild shadows across the snow. At their head rode Deputy Harlan, his badge gleaming dully in the firelight. His mount's hooves churned the pristine snow into muddy chaos as the group circled the porch like wolves around prey. "Well, ain't this touching?" Harlan's voice dripped with mockery as he dismounted. The happy couple's first evening together. His spurs jangled against the frozen ground as he approached, hand resting on his holstered revolver. Brian stepped forward, positioning himself between Sophia and the deputy. "State your business, friend. We're peaceful folk here." Harlan's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Peaceful folk? Maybe. But harboring a criminal ain't exactly peaceful." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Got here a warrant for the arrest of one Sophia Whitmore, charged with fraud and misrepresentation." "That's nonsense." Brian's voice remained steady, though his shoulders tensed. "My wife has done nothing wrong." "Wife?" Harlan spat into the snow. "According to this, she came here claiming to be promised to another man, representing herself falsely as a mail-order bride. That's fraud, plain and simple." Martha appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "The Lord knows the truth of her coming here," she declared firmly. "The Lord ain't the law in these parts." Harlan sneered. He nodded to his men. "Take her." 2 riders dismounted and started up the porch steps. Brian spread his arms, blocking their path. "You'll not touch her. We were married proper today before God and witnesses." "Move aside, Stoltzfus." Harlan's voice hardened. "Don't make this worse than it has to be." When Brian stood his ground, one of the men swung his rifle like a club. The wooden stock caught Brian across the temple with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the porch boards as Sophia screamed. "Brian!" She tried to reach him, but rough hands seized her arms. "Let me go, please. He's hurt." Martha rushed to Brian's side as blood trickled from the gash on his forehead, staining the snow crimson. "God have mercy," she whispered, cradling his head. In her lap, the men dragged Sophia down the porch steps, her boots scraping against the wood. She fought against their grip, but they were too strong. A wagon waited in the shadows beyond the torchlight, its bed lined with straw. "Please," Sophia begged as they lifted her toward the wagon. "This is all a mistake. I've done nothing wrong." Lanterns began appearing in the darkness as neighbors, drawn by the commotion, hurried toward the farmstead. But they were too late. The men threw Sophia into the wagon bed, and one climbed in to guard her while another took the reins. "Y'all best stay back," Harlan warned the gathering crowd, his hands still on his gun. "This here's official business." Through tears, Sophia saw the Webbers and Millers standing helplessly in the yard, their faces painted orange by torchlight. Mrs. Miller clutched her shawl, weeping quietly. Old Mr. Webber shook his head in dismay, his wife clutching his arm. "The Lord sees this injustice," Martha called out, still holding Brian's bleeding head. "He will not forget." Harlan mounted his horse, wheeling it around to face the crowd. "Any of you interfere with lawful arrest, you'll find yourselves sharing her cell." He raised his arm. "Move out." The wagon lurched forward as the riders formed up around it. Sophia caught one last glimpse of the farmhouse through her tears. Martha kneeling in the snow, neighbors rushing forward to help, and Brian struggling to rise despite his injury as the wagon disappeared into the darkness. Brian finally managed to get to his knees, blood matting his hair and running down his face. The world spun around him, but he forced himself to stay upright. Neighbors pressed forward with offers of help, but he waved them away. "Brother, let us tend that wound," Martha pleaded, reaching for him with trembling hands. But Brian remained. On his knees in the blood-stained snow, his eyes fixed on the point where the wagon had vanished. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried in the sudden quiet of the yard. "Lord, give me strength. Give me strength to bring her home." The neighbors stood in silent witness as snowflakes began to fall again, covering the trampled yard with fresh white. The torch's angry light had faded, leaving only the stars above and the soft glow from windows to illuminate Brian's solitary vigil in the snow. The county jail's iron door clanged shut with brutal finality. Sophia stumbled in the darkness, her wedding dress catching on rough floorboards as she found her way to a narrow cot. Moonlight filtered through a barred window, casting stark shadows across the cell stone walls. A bitter wind whistled through gaps in the mortar, carrying winter's bite. She pulled a threadbare blanket around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the bone-deep chill. Worse than the cold was the crushing weight of shame. Her mind tortured her with images of Brian bleeding in the snow, of Martha's anguished face, of neighbors watching helplessly as she was dragged away. "What have I brought upon them?" she whispered into the darkness. "Dear Lord, please let Brian be all right." The sound of approaching footsteps made her stiffen. Keys rattled, and a door creaked open at the end of the corridor. A woman appeared, gray-haired and wrapped in a shawl, carrying a tin cup and a plate. "There now, child." The jail matron's voice was gentle as she passed the items through the bars. "Best eat something while it's warm." Sophia's hands trembled as she accepted the offering, a chunk of bread and some thin soup. "Thank you," she managed. The matron glanced over her shoulder before leaning closer. "Name's Mrs. Guthrie." "Don't you give up hope, dear. That Amish fellow of yours? He ain't the type to abandon his own." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. "I fear I've brought nothing but trouble to his door." The railroad men hushed now. Mrs. Guthrie interrupted softly. "Them railroad types, they've been causing grief all over. But good folk won't stand for it forever." She patted Sophia's hand through the bars. "Keep your strength up. Providence works in mysterious ways." Miles away, Brian urged his horse through the pre-dawn gloom, ignoring the throbbing in his temple where Martha had bandaged the wound. His jaw was set with determination as he guided the mount down the quiet main street toward an orange glow. At the edge of town, the blacksmith's forge was already active, sparks dancing in the early morning darkness. Jonah Redbird's powerful frame cast long shadows as he worked the bellows, his dark hair tied back from his face. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, recognition crossing his features. "Brother Stoltzfus," he greeted, setting aside his hammer. "You ride early and with trouble written on your brow." Brian dismounted carefully, still unsteady. "I need your help, Jonah. They've taken my wife." Jonah's expression darkened. "The railroad men?" When Brian nodded, the Cherokee craftsman's hands tightened on his leather apron. "Tell me." As Brian related the events of the previous night, Jonah's face grew increasingly grim. When Brian finished, the blacksmith was silent for a long moment, staring into the glowing coals of his forge. "I remember when you stood for me in the mercantile," Jonah finally said. When those drunks thought to make sport of a Cherokee, he met Brian's eyes. "You said then that all men deserve dignity under God's sky." "I meant those words," Brian replied quietly. As did I when I swore friendship. Jonah removed his apron. These railroad men, they push us all aside like leaves before a storm. They took my cousin's grazing land with paper lies 2 months past. He moved to a wooden chest and withdrew a worn ledger. Others have suffered the same. The the Millers, even old Thompson, who runs the livery. Brian leaned forward. Sophia, my wife, she can spot forged deeds. Her father taught her. Then we have a weapon they don't expect. Jonah's smile was fierce, but controlled. Let me send word to those who've been wronged. We'll gather at sunset behind the cooper's shop. As the sun climbed higher, Jonah worked his forge as usual, but riders slipped away from his shop carrying messages. By midday, word had spread quietly through town. The cooper's shop backed against a grove of cottonwoods, offering privacy from prying eyes. When evening fell, shapes moved through the shadows toward the meeting place. The Weber family arrived first, then the Millers. Old Thompson came limping on his cane, and others followed, faces lined with worry, but eyes bright with purpose. Each had a story of railroad men presenting suspicious deeds of threats veiled. As Progress Brian stood before them, his bandaged head a testament to the cost of resistance. My wife can prove these deeds false, he told the gathered group. But first, we must free her. She's God's instrument in this, though the railroad men don't know it. We're with you, Brother Stoltzfus, Mr. Weber declared, and heads nodded in. Agreement? Jonah stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority. Together, we are strong. Divided, they pick us off one by one. He placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. First, we gather evidence. Then, we show the world their crimes. As the group huddled closer, plans began to form. Each person had a piece to contribute: knowledge of railroad movements, copies of suspicious documents, witnesses to threats made. Hope kindled in the growing darkness, a flame of resistance born in whispers and shared purpose. The first hints of daybreak painted the eastern sky in pale grays as Brian and Jonah rode out. Frost coated the prairie grass, crunching under their horses' hooves. They had a list of names, neighbors who'd faced the railroad's pressure, and determination burning in their hearts. Their first stop was the Miller homestead, where old Jacob Miller sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming coffee cup. His wife Sarah brought out fresh bread while he spoke. They came 3 times, Jacob said, pulling worn papers from a drawer. Each time with different numbers, different promises. Said the deed I held wasn't properly registered. His weathered hands trembled. Been farming this land 20 years. Brian carefully stored the documents in his saddlebag while Jonah made notes in a small leather book. They visited 4 more farms before noon, each story similar railroad men arriving with suspicious paperwork. Veiled threats wrapped in smooth talk about progress at the Weber place. Mrs. Weber wept as she showed them letters threatening to fence off their water access. Her husband's father dug that well himself, she said. How can they claim rights to it? The sun climbed higher as they made their way into town. The schoolhouse stood empty, it being Saturday, but Miss Henderson was there grading papers. The young teacher's eyes widened when Brian explained their mission. I've been keeping records, she said, hurrying to her desk. The railroad men don't think much of a woman's attention to detail. She withdrew a stack of letters from a locked drawer. They sent different versions of the same offer to families all over the county. The dates don't match up. Jonah studied the papers, his expression grim. This shows pattern of deception. Circuit Judge will need to see. While they gathered evidence, Sophia faced her own battles in the jail cell. The cold seeped through stone walls, but she refused to let it penetrate her spirit. Each morning, she stood at the barred window where thin sunlight fell, reciting psalms in a clear voice. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want, her words. carried to other cells, where women held on petty charges listened with growing hope. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Mrs. Guthrie, the jail matron, often paused in her rounds to listen. One morning, she brought an extra blanket. "Your voice gives them courage," she whispered. "Some haven't heard kind words in months." Sophia began teaching Scripture to those who asked, finding strength in sharing faith. Even the most hardened. Inmates grew quiet when she spoke of grace and redemption. Late one night, after the last guard check, a soft whistle caught her attention. Sophia crept to the window, her heart leaping at the sight of Brian standing in the shadows below. "Beloved," he whispered, reaching up toward the bars. Their fingers touched briefly in the darkness. "Brian," she breathed, drinking in the sight. "Of him? Are you well?" "Your wound healing clean," he assured her. "We're gathering proof of the railroad schemes. Jonah and I spoke with 12 families today. Miss Henderson provided letters showing how they changed their stories." Tears glimmered in Sophia's eyes, catching the moonlight. "I was so afraid. My presence brought this trouble to your door." "No." Brian's voice was firm but gentle. "God sent you to help us fight this evil. Your knowledge of contracts, your strength of spirit, these are His gifts working through you." Sophia pressed closer to the bars, drawing comfort from his nearness. "I've been so afraid," she admitted. "But teaching Scripture to the others here, it reminds me that God's purpose works even in dark places." "Hold fast to that truth, Brian." Urged, "I won't rest until you're free. The circuit judge arrives in 3 days. We'll have evidence ready." "I believe God sent me to you," Sophia whispered, tears flowing freely now. "Not just for marriage, but for this moment. To help all these people stand against injustice." Brian reached up again, touching her hand. "Your faith strengthens mine, beloved. When I falter, I remember your courage." A guard's footsteps echoed in the distance. Brian quickly pressed something into Sophia's hand, a small leather-bound Bible. To replace the one they took, he whispered, "Stay strong. I'll return tomorrow night." As he melted into the shadows, Sophia clutched the Bible to her chest. Inside, she found a pressed wildflower and a note in Brian's careful hand. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." She returned to her cot, the Bible tucked safely in her skirts. Despite the cold stone walls surrounding her, warmth bloomed in her heart. Brian's visit had renewed her resolve. Together, they would face whatever trials lay ahead, trusting in God's purpose and the strength of their bond, in the darkness of her cell. Sophia began to pray, not for herself, but for all those affected. By the railroad's greed, her whispered words joined the night chorus of crickets and distant coyotes, a hymn of hope rising toward the stars. Dawn crept over the town as people began gathering outside the courthouse. The morning air held a sharp chill, but the growing crowd hardly noticed, their anticipation warming the street. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers, while railroad men in fine suits clustered near the steps, speaking in low voices. Inside, the courtroom's oak benches creaked under the weight of spectators. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through tall windows. The musty scent of old books and leather mingled with the sharp pine smell of freshly swept floors. At precisely 9 o'clock, bootsteps echoed in the corridor. The crowd fell silent as 2 deputies led Sophia into the courtroom. Iron chains clinked at her wrists, but she held her head high. Her simple dress was clean and pressed, her hair neatly braided. Several women in the gallery dabbed at their eyes. Moved by her dignity in the face of shame, Brian sat in the front row beside Jonah Redbird, both men rising respectfully as Sophia passed. Her eyes met Brian's briefly, drawing strength from his. steady gaze. Martha, sitting behind them, clutched her Bible tightly. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. The elderly judge settled behind his bench, peering over wire-rimmed spectacles at the assembled crowd. Railroad Agent Burke sat at the prosecutor's table, immaculate in his tailored suit. His smile never reached his eyes as he rose to speak. "Your Honor, we present a simple case of fraud," Burke declared smoothly. "This woman came west under false pretenses, attempting to secure land through deception. When that failed, she conspired with local malcontents to undermine legitimate business interests." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. Brian and Jonah approached the bench, carrying carefully organized documents. Jonah spread out land deeds across the judge's desk, while Brian explained in his quiet, firm voice. "Your Honor, these papers show pattern of forgery," Brian said. "Notice the ink changes mid-document. Dates conflict. Seals don't match county records." Jonah pointed to specific examples. "This mark here, meant to be Cherokee Nation stamp of approval, but wrong symbol used. No tribal elder would make such mistake." The judge leaned forward, examining the documents through his spectacles. His frown deepened as he compared signatures and seals. Burke's smile faltered. "Mere clerical errors, Your Honor. Nothing sinister." "The court calls Sophia Whitmore," announced the bailiff. Sophia rose gracefully despite her chains. Taking the oath, she faced the crowded courtroom without flinching. Her voice carried clearly as she described arriving at the station, finding no groom, and Brian's kindness in offering shelter. "I later learned my intended husband fled because of debts to the railroad," she testified. "He had been pressured to sign away land that wasn't his to give." Burke's chair scraped the floor as he stood. "Objection, hearsay, and speculation." "Overruled," said Judge Harrison. "Continue, Mrs. Whitmore." Sophia's hands were steady as she pointed out discrepancies in the railroad's documents. "My father was a courthouse clerk for 20 years. He taught me to recognize proper legal forms. These papers show clear signs of tampering." A gasp went up from the gallery as she detailed specific forgeries. Several railroad men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Burke's face darkened with anger. "This woman is a fraud herself," he sneered, pointing at Sophia. "She came here seeking land, nothing more. Now she spins tales to cover her schemes." "I came seeking a home and family," Sophia replied firmly. "God led me to both, along with a chance to stand against injustice. These forged deeds would steal land from honest farmers and native peoples alike." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order. "The court has heard serious allegations requiring careful consideration," he announced. "We will recess until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, at which time I will deliver my judgment." As the bailiff moved to lead Sophia away, Brian stepped forward. Their hands clasped briefly, his work-roughened fingers gentle against her smaller ones. "Keep faith," he whispered. Sophia's smile was bright with trust as the deputies guided her toward the door. The gathered crowd parted respectfully, many nodding encouragement as she passed. Even in chains, she walked tall, knowing she had spoken. Truth in the face of power. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving Brian standing alone by the defense table. He gathered the scattered documents with careful hands, each paper representing a family's hope for justice. Tomorrow would bring the judge's decision, but today truth had been spoken aloud at last. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles. The packed gallery held its breath. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended, waiting. After careful review of evidence presented, the judge began, his voice firm. "This court finds the railroad's deeds are indeed fraudulent. All charges against Mrs. Sophia Whitmore are hereby dismissed." The gallery erupted in cheers. Brian's shoulders sagged with relief as the judge continued. "Furthermore, Mr. Stoltzfus's land rights are upheld in full. Let the record show that any attempts to seize or contest these properties through similar means will face severe penalties." Railroad agent Burke and his men slipped toward the door, faces dark with defeat. Deputy Harlan followed, keeping his eyes on his boots. Outside, deputies removed Sophia's chains. She barely noticed the cold iron falling away as she ran down the courthouse steps. Brian caught her in his arms, holding her close as neighbors gathered around them. Her tears dampened his plain black coat. Jonah Redbird stepped forward, his usually stern face bright with satisfaction. "Justice speaks today," he declared, clasping Brian's shoulder. "The land stays with those who honor it." The celebration spilled onto the street. Martha hugged Sophia tightly, whispering prayers of thanks. A line of wagons formed as neighbors insisted on following them home to mark the victory. That evening, lamplight and warmth filled the farmhouse. Dozens of voices lifted in hymns while Martha served fresh bread and preserves. Candles flickered in every window, their glow reaching into the winter darkness. Sophia sat beside Brian on their wooden bench, her hand in his. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt truly at peace. This was home, not just the house and land, but the community gathered around them. Bound by faith and justice, spring burst forth across the Colorado countryside, turning winter's white blanket into rushing streams. Morning dews sparkled on fresh grass as Sophia and Brian worked together in the soft earth behind their farmhouse. "Hold it steady now," Brian instructed, supporting a young apple sapling while Sophia packed rich soil around its tender roots. The tree's branches reached skyward like hopeful arms. Martha sat nearby on a wooden stool, threading needle and cloth while humming Amazing Grace. Her clear voice carried on the breeze, mixing with birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle. The creak of wagon wheels announced Jonah Redbird's arrival. The Cherokee blacksmith climbed down, carrying carefully wrapped bundles. "Wedding gifts," he announced with a rare smile, unveiling gleaming iron tools, a hoe, spade, and pruning shears, each piece expertly crafted. "These are beautiful, Jonah." Sophia marveled, running her fingers along the smooth handles. Throughout the morning, neighbors stopped by with offerings, packets of vegetable seeds, berry bush cuttings, even a basket of fresh eggs. Each visitor lingered to admire the growing orchard, making the homestead feel like the heart of their community. "Remember when the Millers brought us those pumpkin seeds?" Sarah Jensen called out as she delivered a jar of preserved peaches. "Best crop we ever had. They'll do well here, too." As evening painted the sky in soft pinks and purples, Brian and Sophia settled onto the porch steps. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining like the roots of their newly planted trees. The land stretched before them, rich with promise. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it," Sophia whispered, leaning against Brian's shoulder. "That day at the station, I felt so lost and ashamed. But now," she squeezed his hand, "now I see I was being led exactly where I belonged." Brian nodded, his eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "God's hand was in it all," he said softly. "Every step, every trial. He brought you to us, to this land, to make something beautiful from what seemed broken." Around them, the young apple trees stood like silent witnesses to their journey from winter into spring, from despair into joy. The evening breeze carried Martha's hymn from inside the house, a gentle reminder of faith's power to guide hearts. Home, thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.